we're joined now by Professor Jok Madut Jok, Professor of Anthropology at Syracuse University's Maxwell School, and he's also Executive Director of the Sudd Institute. Professor Jok, always a pleasure to speak to you. Worrying figures, 500 people since the start of 2026. And correct me if I'm wrong, I do fear this figure could be far more than what we're quoting at the moment.
Oh yes, the figure, the war toll is much higher than what we get, especially if you consider people who die from indirect causes, but related to war, such as the destruction of health facilities, which means that people don't have healthcare and die from preventable causes. But also even the war casualty itself is not being documented properly because of insecurity, the lack of access to journalists, lack of access to humanitarian agencies even. And so, yes, the toll is much greater. The war is coming to 3 years this April 15th. And it has definitely devastated the country, 150,000 people dead. So the numbers are bound to increase greatly when and if Sudan's war is going to be subject to quantification of the impact.
Prof, I was just speaking now about the vast resources that Africa enjoys, and I'm also just talking about thought leaders such as yourself. So it's important to get your perspective, not only as a Sudanese, but as a medical anthropologist. What does deliberate targeting of a healthcare lifeline say about the current stage of this conflict and those behind it?
Yeah, no, it's indicative of the level of desperation that the warring parties often reach when the war becomes so protracted and no victory to any side on site. So parties get so desperate that they begin to think that civilian populations are legitimate war targets, so that they can harm the image of the other, such as the drone attack you just referenced at the beginning on El-Daein Teaching Hospital is one of these type of attacks that is usually contested. Nobody is claiming responsibility for it because of the humanitarian consequences, because of the violation of the international humanitarian law, that hospitals are out of bounds for military actors. And yet this is what has happened. So Sudan government denies knowing anything to do with that, and RSF says it is the government of Sudan that hit the teaching hospital, because the RSF is in full control of the city. So they have no reason whatsoever to attack a hospital in a town that they control. And the culprit can only be the armed forces of Sudan. Why they target hospitals and civilians and water points and things like this, it is definitely uprooting the capacity of any population to survive, which in the end is a war crime when you render people such that they are not able to live their lives as they have always known it, by uprooting them from their livelihoods and their lives. It's a war crime.
Prof, is it a fair question to ask, where is the international war crime? Does it matter that the Sudanese armed forces or the RPF deny responsibility for these heinous acts? Is there enough international outcry or even visible outcry over what is happening in the Sudan?
Unfortunately, Sudan's war, though responsible for what is now being called the world's biggest humanitarian crisis, is not really stealing the headlines, especially in the wake of U.S.-Israel war on Iran, and also because of other challenges around the world. Sudan's conflict, unfortunately, is not garnering the global attention it deserves. And as such, there is really no knowing whether anybody will ever ask questions about the violation of international humanitarian law or commission of genocide even. And nobody will ask about it because the documentation is extremely absent. And eventually, of course, it will be studied, it will be investigated. Some blame will be laid at somebody's doorsteps, but it will be too late for people who are caught in it, which is the tragedy of the idea of international humanitarian law, because it seems to only work after the fact.
And not
And
only that,
yeah.
Prof, it is interesting because what we're seeing happen in tandem is this a growing momentum of moderating immigration law as a result of people who are desperate, people who are trying to stay alive along with their families by fleeing to other countries. And while I understand national interest, but what is the international obligation of states? If countries are saying, well, this is really shrinking the rights of their citizens to healthcare, when people are dying or being killed and no one is speaking about it.
Yeah, I think that is the fickleness and the double standard that we notice when tragic things like this, like Gaza, like currently all over the Middle East and Sudan and Chad and all these other major crises, we see these kind of double standards where people seem to make noise about the tragedy of befalling these people, but unwilling to open their doors to people who are fleeing conflicts. Just imagine the whole Arab Middle East folding their arms while the people of Gaza are being bombarded with 12,000 children being killed. So I think that is really the double standard of the international system. The fact that countries who are easily capable of inviting in those fleeing such situations as the situation in Western Sudan and are not being invited, at least for the time being, to escape until they are safe to go back. Because I don't think anybody wants to vacate their country entirely. They just want to seek cover from the war for the time being, and then when the situation returns to normal, they will be able to go back home. The problem is that the parties fighting in Sudan continuously, each side feels like they are on the verge of victory, so they don't want to seek any kind of diplomatic intervention or peaceful intervention from outsiders, because they think that they are just going to win tomorrow. Therefore, they continue to inflict so much harm on the civilian populations under the control of the other side.
But Prof, it's beyond that. Last year, when we were looking at the anniversary of the Geneva Conventions, there were questions abound about, the relevance and efficacy of multilateral institutions. So you have written extensively on the ethnography of political violence. Why has international law failed to provide even basic sanctuary for Sudanese children in hospitals and schools? And that's at a very basic, tragic minimum.
Right. I think the key culprit is the idea of countries having to dance the prerogatives of sovereignty, right? So countries that could help are beholden to the interest that they have, that if they intervene in a humanitarian way, that it can affect their standing vis-a-vis their supporters or their assumed supporters. For example, in the Sudan's war, you have the world is divided between those who are behind the RSF and those who are behind this SAF. And one side which is capable of helping will not help because it will be trampling the interest of the other side. So I think there is that issues of sovereignty. But I think there is also questions of fear that these people who are fleeing this type of situations coming in will become a burden on the resources of the country. They will not only become a burden in terms of material resources, there are always fears, cultural issues, religious issues, the growth of terrorism. All these things are often put up by countries as reasons why they are not so willing to open their doors. The international law itself is really about a consensus of countries. The ability to enforce them rely on countries being able to reach a consensus. There is no one entity that has the power to enforce them. Otherwise, the international law can only work, is as good as countries agreeing.
Wouldn't then it be to the best interest of international mediators then as a collective to prevent the flow of illegal weapons that are fueling, so to speak, the war on both sides? Shouldn't they be using the full muster of their collective effort to stop the flow of even specific technologies that are killing vulnerable communities indiscriminately?
Absolutely. It would be, if you take the weapons off the hands of belligerents, that would definitely contribute towards promoting the idea of primacy of and sanctity of human life. But the challenge, of course, is still a matter of who is going to enforce this idea when weapons are a big business. So even if countries agree at the level of governments to limit the flow of weapons, it's still going to be extremely difficult to prevent the illicit flow of weapons. Especially in the African context where the lines, the battle lines are not so clear, where gun runners are able to slip through forests and porous borders. But even when you know the countries like the UAE, which is supplying the RSF with drones, and Saudi Arabia and Egypt, supplying the Sudan government side, even when you know the entities are not genuine and honest in saying that, yes, we are going to put an end to the supply of weapons. Because if we did, then we erode the balance of powers. Because if UAE didn't give to RSF, the Sudan government would prevail, and that would lead to a lopsided balance of power. So what you want, it's a race to the top, really, in terms of weapons. If you provide each side with weapons, you create a balance of power, and therefore people will be willing to seek reconciliation. But if you so it's a cycle that is unending. The more weapons, the more war. The fewer weapons, the more likely that one end will take advantage of that by receiving weapons from illicit parties.
Prof, let me ask this as a final question. Given that run for the race for arms that you speak of and the approaching 3-year mark of the war in April, does the current situation make a negotiated settlement or ceasefire even more urgent, or does it rather deepen the revenge mission cycle that you've been warning about?
For a long time, I've been saying that this war will not be winnable militarily, and even the parties seem to recognize this. But even then, none of them is giving up hope of eventually being able to win. So what the whole world needs to do right now, in whatever little capacity they can have, to de-escalate the conflict, This is what the UN is calling for, the WHO, the other agencies that are intervening in humanitarian way are saying, first of all, we need to de-escalate the conflict so that at least we can go in to rescue the situation by treating the wounded and evacuating people that need to be evacuated. That is at the very basic level. You need a ceasefire. How that ceasefire is going to be uh, forced on the parties is the challenge. So long as the international entities, the UN, the African Union, the Arab League, the IGAD countries that may have some degree of leverage on the parties to let up the fight so that there can be a good humanitarian intervention. That is the challenge. Whether the parties are willing to listen to these international and regional entities.
Prof, thank you so much for speaking to us as always. Professor Jok Madut Jok, Professor of Anthropology at Syracuse University's Maxwell School and Executive Director of the Sudd Institute. He was also Under Secretary of the government there in South Sudan. So he's just speaking to us about what is happening there at the moment, the huge humanitarian crisis, unprecedented, and just what is the problem and how it can be resolved, if at all.